In the summer of 1991, a father and his 12-year-old son left Portland, Oregon, on what was supposed to be a 2-week road trip to Yellowstone National Park. They never arrived. For 33 years, their disappearance remained one of the Pacific Northwest's most baffling missing persons cases, until a wildfire in rural Montana exposed something that had been hidden beneath the forest floor for decades. What investigators found would unravel a nightmare that began on a lonely mountain highway and reveal that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we should fear. If you're fascinated by true crime mysteries and unsolved disappearances, subscribe now and join us as we uncover the disturbing truth behind cases that have haunted families for generations. The photograph had been taken 3 days before they disappeared. David Pritchard stood beside their silver Ford Explorer, one arm draped around his son Owen's shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. Owen held a fishing rod in his free hand, excited about the promise of trout-filled streams in Yellowstone. David wore his favorite denim jacket and that confident smile Helen had fallen in love with 15 years earlier. Helen had taken the photo in their driveway, the morning sun casting long shadows across the suburban Portland street. She remembered how Owen had bounced on his toes with barely contained excitement, how David had kissed her goodbye and promised they'd call from every stop along the way. That was June 14, 1991. They called from a motel in Pendleton that first night. David's voice had been warm, reassuring. Owen had grabbed the phone to tell her about the enormous burger he'd eaten for dinner, his words tumbling over each other in his enthusiasm. They'd be in Missoula by tomorrow night, David said, then on to Yellowstone by the weekend. The second night, they called from a rest stop somewhere in Idaho. The connection was scratchy and David sounded tired, but everything was fine. Owen was already asleep in the back seat. They'd pushed through more miles than planned. David thought they might reach Montana by noon the next day. That was the last time Helen Pritchard heard her husband's voice. June 16th came and went with no call. Helen told herself the mountains interfered with phone signals, that they'd gotten caught up in the adventure and lost track of time. By June 17th, the knot in her stomach had grown into full-blown panic. She called the Montana State Police, the park rangers at Yellowstone, every motel along Interstate 90. No one had seen David Pritchard or his 12-year-old son. The Silver Explorer with Oregon plates seemed to have vanished into thin air. The investigation that followed consumed Helen's life. Search teams combed highways and forest roads. David's credit cards were never used again after a gas station charge in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, on June 15th. No bodies were found, no witnesses came forward. The FBI investigated whether David had taken Owen and disappeared intentionally, but nothing in his life suggested he would abandon his wife and his dental practice. His bank accounts remained untouched. His passport stayed in his desk drawer. As months turned into years, the media attention faded. The case went cold. Helen refused to accept that they were gone forever. She kept their rooms exactly as they'd left them. She never stopped searching, never stopped hoping that somehow, somewhere, David and Owen were still alive. 33 years later, on an October morning in 2024, Helen's phone rang with news that would finally give her answers, though not the ones she'd prayed for. A wildfire had swept through a remote area of western Montana, burning away decades of forest undergrowth and exposing what lay beneath. A hiker had spotted something metallic glinting in the scorched earth. When investigators arrived, they found a vehicle buried in a shallow ravine, covered by 30 years of accumulated soil, branches, and vegetation. The license plates were still attached. Oregon, PTR 4429. David Pritchard's Ford Explorer had been found. Helen Pritchard's hands trembled as she set her coffee cup on the kitchen table, the liquid sloshing over the rim and staining the newspaper beneath. Her daughter Claire sat across from her, gripping her own mug with white knuckles. Neither had slept after the call from Detective Amanda Reeves of the Montana State Police. The autumn morning light filtered through the Portland kitchen windows, casting the same gentle glow that had illuminated this room 33 years ago when Helen had kissed David and Owen goodbye. She'd replaced the curtains twice since then, repainted the walls, bought new appliances, but the kitchen still felt frozen in time, haunted by that last ordinary morning when her family had been whole. "They want you to fly to Montana," Claire said quietly. She was 28 now, only 3 years old when her father and brother had vanished. She had no real memories of them, just photographs and stories and the shadow of grief that had shaped her entire childhood. Helen nodded, unable to find words. After 3 decades of searching, of false leads and crushing disappointments, of nights spent staring at that photograph of David and Owen grinning beside the Explorer, the vehicle had finally been found. But the detective's careful tone had told Helen everything she needed to know. This wasn't a rescue. This was a recovery. "I need to see it," Helen said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I need to know what happened to them." Claire reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. "I'm coming with you." "Sweetheart, you don't have to—" "Mom, I was 3 years old when they disappeared. I've lived my entire life in the shadow of this mystery." Claire's eyes, the same hazel as David's, were fierce with determination. "I need closure too." The flight to Missoula departed that afternoon. Helen moved through the preparations mechanically, packing clothes she barely registered, printing boarding passes, locking the house that had been her prison and her shrine for 33 years. In her carry-on, she placed the photograph of David and Owen beside the Explorer, the image worn soft from countless hours of staring at it, searching their faces for some clue she might have missed. Montana looked different in October than she'd imagined it would in June. The mountains blazed with autumn color, gold and amber and deep crimson, under skies of crystalline blue. As their rental car climbed into the wilderness west of Missoula, Helen felt the landscape pressing in around her, beautiful and vast and utterly indifferent to human suffering. Detective Reeves had given them directions to a small ranger station near the discovery site. The woman who met them there was in her 40s, her face weathered by mountain winters, and her eyes carrying the particular gravity of someone who dealt with death regularly. "Mrs. Pritchard, I'm Detective Amanda Reeves." She shook Helen's hand firmly, then Claire's. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss, and for the long years you've waited for answers." Helen's throat tightened. "Have you found them? David and Owen?" Detective Reeves gestured toward her patrol vehicle. "Let's sit down. There's a lot I need to tell you." They settled into the station's small conference room, coffee cups untouched on the scarred wooden table. Through the window, Helen could see the mountains rising against the sky, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "The vehicle was discovered by a hiker 3 days ago," Detective Reeves began, opening a folder filled with photographs. "It was buried in a ravine about 15 miles from here, down a decommissioned logging road that hasn't been used since the mid-'80s. The wildfire burned away the vegetation that had grown over it." She slid a photograph across the table. Helen forced herself to look. The silver Explorer was barely recognizable, its paint faded and body crushed from decades of soil pressure, but there was no mistaking it. "We excavated the vehicle yesterday," Detective Reeves continued. "Mrs. Pritchard, I need to prepare you. We found human remains inside." The room seemed to tilt. Claire's hand found Helen's arm, anchoring her. "Both of them," Helen whispered. Detective Reeves's expression shifted, something complicated moving behind her eyes. "That's where this gets complicated. We found one set of remains in the driver's seat. Based on the size and preliminary examination, we believe it's an adult male. The forensic team is working to confirm identity through dental records and DNA, but given the circumstances, we're confident it's your husband, David." Helen's vision blurred with tears. After 33 years of not knowing, of hoping against all logic that David might still be alive somewhere, the confirmation landed like a physical blow. Claire wrapped an arm around her mother's shoulders. "And Owen?" Claire asked when Helen couldn't speak. Detective Reeves hesitated, and in that pause, Helen felt something cold settle in her chest. "We found no evidence of a child in the vehicle," the detective said carefully. "No remains, no clothing, no personal effects that would indicate your son was in the Explorer when it went into that ravine." Helen's head snapped up. What? But they were traveling together. Owen was with him. I know, Detective Reeves said gently, and that's what makes this case particularly troubling. The vehicle shows evidence of having been deliberately driven off the road. The wheels were turned toward the ravine. The gear shift was in drive. But there's something else. She pulled out another photograph, this one a close-up of the Explorer's interior. Even through the decay and damage, Helen could see dark stains on what remained of the upholstery. We found evidence of blood in the passenger compartment, a significant amount. Initial tests suggest at least 2 different blood types. Detective Reeves's voice dropped. Mrs. Pritchard, we don't believe this was an accident. The evidence suggests your husband was injured, possibly already deceased, when the vehicle went into that ravine. And we believe someone else was involved, someone who may have taken your son. The words seemed to come from very far away. Helen heard them but couldn't process them, couldn't reconcile them with the David she'd known, the loving father who'd planned every detail of that road trip to make it special for Owen. You're saying someone killed David and kidnapped Owen? Claire's voice was sharp with disbelief. That's one theory we're pursuing, Detective Reeves said. But I need to be honest with you. After 33 years, finding your son alive is statistically unlikely. However, the absence of his remains gives us something we didn't have before: hope and questions that need answers. Helen stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. She walked to the window, pressing her palms against the glass as if she could push through it and into the past, as if she could reach back through the decades and stop David and Owen from leaving Portland that June morning. All these years, I thought maybe it was an accident, she said to the mountains, that they drove off a cliff in a storm, or the car broke down somewhere remote and they died of exposure. I imagined them together at least, not suffering alone. Helen. Detective Reeves joined her at the window. I promise you, we're going to find out what happened. The case is officially reopened. We're bringing in the FBI, conducting a full investigation. Someone knew your husband and son were on that road. Someone interacted with them in the days before the vehicle was abandoned. We're going to trace their route, interview anyone who might remember something, examine every piece of evidence. Helen turned to face the detective. You think Owen might still be alive? I think we can't rule it out, Detective Reeves said carefully. 12-year-old boys who disappear don't usually leave no trace. If he died in Montana that June, we should have found remains somewhere, especially given how extensively the area was searched back in 1991. The fact that we haven't suggests he left this area, one way or another. Claire had joined them at the window, her face pale but composed. What do we do now? Now, you let us do our jobs, Detective Reeves said, and you prepare yourselves for what we might find. After 33 years, there will be answers, but they may not be the ones you want to hear. As they drove back down the mountain that evening, Helen stared out at the darkening landscape. Somewhere in this wilderness, David had died, and somewhere, somehow, Owen had vanished. The question that would haunt her through the sleepless nights ahead was simple and terrible. Had her son spent the last 33 years alive, taken by someone who'd killed his father? Or had he died that day, too, his body simply never found? Either answer was a nightmare. But after 33 years of not knowing, Helen would take even a nightmare if it meant finally understanding what had happened on that lonely Montana highway in the summer of 1991. The medical examiner's office in Missoula smelled of industrial cleaner and something else Helen couldn't identify and didn't want to. She sat in a waiting room with beige walls and outdated magazines, Claire beside her, both women silent with anticipation and dread. Detective Reeves had called that morning, 72 hours after their first meeting. The forensic examination had revealed information that changed everything, she'd said. Could Helen and Claire come to Missoula today? Now they waited while somewhere in this building, strangers examined what remained of David Pritchard and tried to extract answers from bones that had lain hidden for more than 3 decades. The door opened and Detective Reeves entered, followed by a tall woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a white coat over professional attire and carried a thick folder. "Mrs. Pritchard, Claire, this is Dr. Patricia Wolfe, our chief medical examiner." Detective Reeves's expression was carefully neutral, but Helen had learned to read the tension in her shoulders. Something was wrong. Or rather, something was more wrong than they'd already known. "I appreciate you coming in," Dr. Wolfe said, her voice professionally gentle as she settled into a chair across from them. "I know this is incredibly difficult. I've examined the remains found in your husband's vehicle, and I need to discuss our findings with you." Helen nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "First, I can confirm through dental records that the remains are definitively those of David Pritchard," Dr. Wolfe began. "I'm very sorry for your loss." After 33 years, the confirmation should have brought some kind of closure. Instead, Helen felt only a deepening of the void that had opened in her life that June day in 1991. "Thank you," she managed. Dr. Wolfe opened her folder, revealing photographs and documents Helen didn't want to examine too closely. "The cause of death is complicated by the extended post-mortem interval and environmental factors. However, the remains tell us several important things about what happened to your husband." She pulled out an image of what appeared to be a bone, marked with annotations Helen couldn't decipher. David suffered blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. There are also fractures to the ribs and left arm that suggest a violent struggle. Most significantly, we found evidence of a stab wound to the chest cavity. The knife penetrated between the ribs and would have caused severe internal bleeding. Claire made a small, choked sound. Helen felt as if she were watching the scene from outside her body, observing some other woman receiving news of her husband's murder. "So he was killed," Helen said, her voice surprisingly steady, "before the car went into the ravine." "Yes," Dr. Wolfe confirmed. "The injuries are not consistent with a vehicle accident. Your husband was assaulted, stabbed, and then placed in the driver's seat of his own vehicle. Based on the blood spatter patterns in the car and the position of the remains, we believe he was already deceased or near death when the Explorer was driven into that ravine." Detective Reeves leaned forward. "Mrs. Pritchard, this confirms we're investigating a homicide. Whoever killed your husband went to significant effort to hide the body and make it look like an accident or disappearance." "And Owen?" The name came out as barely more than a whisper. "If David was murdered, what happened to my son?" Dr. Wolfe and Detective Reeves exchanged glances. It was the detective who spoke. "We found something else at the scene, discovered during a more thorough search of the ravine after we removed the vehicle." She pulled out a plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be a piece of fabric. "This was buried about 30 feet from where the Explorer came to rest. It's a child's sneaker, size 6. Consistent with what a 12-year-old boy might wear. The brand matches what you told us Owen was wearing when they left Portland." Helen took the evidence bag with shaking hands. The sneaker was filthy, stained with decades of soil and decay, but she recognized it immediately. Blue and white, the kind Owen had begged for because his best friend had a pair. She'd bought them for him the week before the trip, watching him lace them up with such pride. "There's blood on the shoe," Detective Reeves said quietly. "We're running DNA analysis, but given the location and the size, we have reason to believe it belonged to Owen." "Just one shoe?" Claire asked, her voice tight. "Just one. No other clothing, no other personal effects, and no remains." Detective Reeves paused. "Mrs. Pritchard, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your husband, about your family situation in 1991. Helen looked up from the sneaker, confused by the shift in direction. "Our family situation? You reported David and Owen missing on June 17, 1991, when they failed to call or return as expected," Detective Reeves said, consulting her notes. "The initial investigation looked into whether David might have taken Owen and disappeared intentionally. I know that possibility was ruled out at the time, but I need to revisit it. Was there any tension in your marriage? Any suggestion David might have wanted to leave? No, Helen said firmly. David loved our family. He loved his work. There was no reason he would run away, and certainly no reason he would take Owen from me. We were happy. What about financial problems? Gambling debts? Any connections to criminal activity? David was a dentist. He had a successful practice. We had a comfortable life. Helen's voice hardened. Detective, my husband was murdered. He didn't stage his own disappearance. Someone killed him. I know, Detective Reeves said gently. But we need to understand why. Who would want to hurt David? Did he have any enemies? Anyone who'd threatened him or your family? Helen thought back, trying to pull details from memories that had grown hazy with time and grief. There was nothing like that. David was well liked. His patients loved him. He coached Owen's Little League team, volunteered at our church. He was just a normal man, a good man. Dr. Wolf cleared her throat. There's one more thing you need to know. During the autopsy, I found something in the vehicle that wasn't biological evidence. She produced another evidence bag, this one containing what appeared to be a small plastic card, discolored and damaged, but still partially legible. Helen took it, squinting at the faded text. It appeared to be some kind of identification badge, the kind that might hang on a lanyard. She could make out part of a name and what might be a logo. We're working on enhancing the image, Detective Reeves said, but you can see enough to tell it's not David's. The partial name visible doesn't match his, and the format suggests it's from some kind of facility or organization. We believe whoever killed your husband may have dropped this in the vehicle. So you have a lead, Claire said, hope flickering in her voice. You can trace this to whoever did this. We're working on it, Detective Reeves said, but I need to manage your expectations. This badge has been degraded by more than 30 years of exposure. The database systems from 1991 may not exist anymore. But yes, it's something. It's more than we had before. Helen stared at the badge, this tiny artifact that might hold the key to everything. Someone had worn this. Someone had been close enough to David and Owen to lose it in their vehicle. Someone who had killed her husband and taken her son. I want to see where it happened, Helen said suddenly. The place where you found the explorer. I need to see it. Detective Reeves hesitated. Mrs. Pritchard, it's a difficult site to reach, and there's not much to see now that we've removed the vehicle and processed the scene. I don't care. Helen's voice was steel. For 33 years, I've imagined every possible scenario. I've tortured myself with questions. Now I know David died in Montana, that someone murdered him and did something to Owen. I need to see the place. I need to stand where my son stood last. The detective studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'll take you tomorrow morning. But I'm warning you, Mrs. Pritchard, it's not going to give you the closure you're looking for. If anything, seeing it might make this harder. Everything about this is hard, Helen said quietly. It has been for 33 years. At least now I'm getting closer to the truth. That night, in their Missoula hotel room, Helen lay awake staring at the ceiling while Claire slept fitfully in the other bed. She thought about David, about the fear and pain he must have felt in those final moments. Had he tried to protect Owen? Had he known what was happening to his son? And Owen, 12 years old, watching his father die, wearing the blue and white sneakers she'd bought him, walking into a nightmare. Had he been killed too? His body disposed of somewhere they'd never find? Or had something worse happened? The question that haunted her most was one she couldn't voice even to Claire. What if Owen was alive? What if her son had spent the last 33 years in captivity, or had been raised by whoever killed David, living an entire life stolen from the family that loved him? Both possibilities were unbearable. But as Helen watched dawn break over the Montana mountains, she knew that whatever the truth was, she would find it. She owed David and Owen that much. She owed herself that much. The nightmare that had begun in 1991 was finally coming into focus, and Helen Pritchard was ready to face whatever horrors emerged from the shadows, no matter how terrible they might be. The logging road hadn't been maintained in decades. Detective Reeves's patrol vehicle bounced over ruts and rocks, branches scraping against the sides as they climbed deeper into the Montana wilderness. Helen sat in the passenger seat, Claire in the back, all three women silent as the forest closed in around them. It was early morning, mist still clinging to the valleys between mountains. The autumn colors that had seemed so beautiful from a distance now felt oppressive, like the forest was ablaze with some slow-burning fire. Helen watched the trees pass by, thinking about David and Owen driving these roads 33 years ago, unsuspecting, heading toward a nightmare they couldn't have imagined. The old logging company shut down in 1987, Detective Reeves said, breaking the silence. After that, these roads were essentially abandoned. We're about 2 miles from the nearest maintained highway. Back in 1991, this would have been even more isolated. How did you search this area the first time? Claire asked. When they were first reported missing. We did, Detective Reeves said, her voice tight with frustration. Search teams covered hundreds of square miles, but this particular ravine is deep and was heavily overgrown even then. The explorer went down at an angle that put it under a natural overhang of rock. Then you add 30 years of soil erosion, fallen trees, vegetation growth. It created a perfect hiding place. Helen watched the forest pass by, imagining search helicopters overhead, teams of volunteers walking these woods, everyone looking for her missing family. She'd been one of those volunteers flying to Montana 3 times in the months after the disappearance, walking until her feet bled, calling Owen's name until her voice gave out. And all that time, David had been here, buried in the earth, while Owen had been somewhere else entirely. The vehicle lurched to a stop. We walk from here, Detective Reeves said. It's about a quarter mile through the trees. They climbed out into the cold mountain air. Helen pulled her jacket tighter, following the detective along a narrow path marked with orange flagging tape left by the forensic team. The ground was soft with decades of pine needles, and the silence was profound, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional cry of a bird. After 15 minutes of steady hiking, the trees opened onto a steep ravine. Yellow crime scene tape still marked the area, fluttering in the breeze. Helen approached slowly, her heart pounding. The ravine dropped away sharply, maybe 40 feet to a rocky bottom where a thin stream trickled between stones. She could see the disturbed earth where the explorer had been excavated, a dark scar in the landscape. It came down at an angle, Detective Reeves said, pointing to gouges in the earth that led from the old logging road to the ravine. Whoever drove it aimed for this spot deliberately. The vehicle rolled twice before coming to rest against those rocks at the bottom. Helen stepped closer to the edge, and Claire grabbed her arm to steady her. Below, she could see the impression where the explorer had lain for 33 years, a vehicle-shaped depression in the soil. Scattered around it were small numbered markers where evidence had been collected. Where was the shoe found? Helen asked. Detective Reeves pointed to a spot about 30 feet downstream from the main excavation site. Over there, partially buried under that fallen log. It's possible it was thrown from the vehicle during the initial crash, or someone discarded it separately. Helen carefully made her way down the slope, ignoring the detective's warning about the unstable ground. She needed to stand where Owen had stood, needed to feel the place where her family's story had ended. The earth was still torn up from the excavation, and she could see fragments of glass glinting in the soil, pieces of the explorer's windows. When she reached the bottom, she stood in the impression left by the vehicle. The stream gurgled nearby, indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded here. She tried to imagine David's last moments, tried to reconstruct what had happened. Someone had attacked him, stabbed him, beaten him. Then they'd put his body in the driver's seat and sent the explorer plunging into this ravine. But where was Owen during all of this? Had he watched his father die? Had he tried to run? The single bloody sneaker suggested he'd been here, but the absence of any other trace suggested he'd been taken away. "Mrs. Pritchard, there's something else I need to show you," Detective Reeves called from above. Helen climbed back up, her breath coming hard from exertion and emotion. The detective had moved further along the ravine to where another cluster of evidence markers dotted the ground. When we did the expanded search after finding the vehicle, we brought in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, Detective Reeves explained. The dogs hit on this area, but we didn't find any human remains. What we did find was this. She gestured to a spot where the earth had been carefully excavated and then refilled. A single evidence marker stood beside a small pit. We found fragments of clothing buried here, a child's t-shirt or what was left of one, size and style consistent with 1991. There was blood on it, and preliminary DNA testing suggests it's Owen's blood. Helen felt the ground tilt beneath her. His shirt. You found his shirt? Yes. It had been cut away from the body, the way you might remove clothing from an injured person. Or a victim. Detective Reeves's voice was gentle but firm. Mrs. Pritchard, whoever took Owen removed his bloody clothing and buried it here. That suggests a level of planning, of covering tracks. They didn't want anyone finding evidence of what happened. But why bury the shirt and shoes separately from David? Claire asked, her face pale. Why not just hide everything in the ravine with the car? That's an excellent question, Detective Reeves said. And it suggests something important about our perpetrator's state of mind. They were organized enough to hide evidence, but perhaps panicked or disturbed enough to make mistakes. Burying the clothing separately might indicate they were interrupted, or they changed their plan midway through. Helen walked to the burial site, staring down at the refilled earth. Was there a lot of blood on the shirt? A significant amount, yes. More than you'd see from a minor injury. Detective Reeves paused. Mrs. Pritchard, I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that Owen died here too, and his remains were taken somewhere else. No, Helen said, the word sharp and certain. If Owen died, you would have found him. Whoever did this killed David because he was in the way. They took Owen for a reason. What reason? Claire asked softly. Helen didn't have an answer. The possibilities that filled her mind were too horrible to speak aloud. A 12-year-old boy, taken by someone capable of murder. What could they have wanted him for? They stood in silence, the three women surrounded by the Montana wilderness, standing on ground that held secrets that had festered for 33 years. The morning mist had burned away, and sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the crime scene in harsh detail. There's one more thing, Detective Reeves said. She pulled out her phone and showed Helen a photograph. We found this carved into one of the trees near the ravine. It's weathered, but you can still make it out. Helen took the phone, squinting at the image. Someone had carved letters into the bark of a pine tree, crude and uneven but still legible after decades. Help me. We can't be certain Owen carved this, Detective Reeves cautioned. It could have been here before 1991. It could be from a completely unrelated incident. But given the location and the age of the carving, we have to consider it might be from your son. Helen traced the letters on the screen with her finger. Help me. 2 words that could have been Owen's last message. A desperate plea carved into a tree while his father lay dead in a ravine, and someone who meant him harm stood nearby. He was alive long enough to do this, Helen said, her voice breaking. He was trying to leave us a sign. If it was him, yes, Detective Reeves agreed. And that supports the theory that Owen was taken alive from this location. As they hiked back to the patrol vehicle, Helen looked back at the ravine one final time. The crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, marking the spot where her husband had been buried for 33 years. But Owen's story didn't end here. It had continued beyond this ravine, beyond this forest, into some dark place Helen couldn't yet see. She would find that place. She would follow Owen's trail, no matter where it led or how long it took. The carved message in the tree was a thread connecting her to her son across the decades. He'd called for help, and even 33 years later, Helen was determined to answer. The Montana State Police headquarters in Missoula hummed with activity when Helen and Claire arrived the next morning. Detective Reeves had called at 7, asking them to come in immediately. There had been a break in the case, she'd said, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Now they sat in a conference room while Detective Reeves and 2 FBI agents set up a presentation on a large monitor. One of the agents, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, introduced herself as Special Agent Victoria Torres. "Mrs. Pritchard, we've made significant progress in the last 24 hours, Agent Torres began. The ID badge we found in your husband's vehicle has given us our first real lead." She clicked a button, and the monitor displayed an enhanced image of the damaged badge Helen had seen before. The restoration work was remarkable. What had been a barely legible blur was now sharp enough to read. "Mountain Vista Youth Services," Helen read aloud. "What is that?" "That's what we wanted to know," Agent Torres said. Mountain Vista Youth Services was a private residential facility for troubled youth, located about 60 miles north of where we found your husband's vehicle. It operated from 1987 to 1994. Detective Reeves pulled up another screen, this one showing an aerial photograph of a compound surrounded by forest. Large buildings arranged around a central courtyard, high fences, isolated location. The facility claimed to provide therapeutic services for teenagers with behavioral problems, Agent Torres continued. Parents paid significant fees to have their children housed there for months or years at a time, but in 1994, the facility was raided by federal authorities following allegations of abuse. Helen felt a chill run through her. What kind of abuse? Physical, psychological, and in some cases, sexual abuse of the minors in their care, Agent Torres said, her voice hard. The director and several staff members were arrested. Some went to prison. The facility was shut down permanently. "You think someone from this place killed my husband and took Owen?" Helen asked, trying to process what she was hearing. "We think it's highly probable," Agent Torres said. "The badge belongs to a man named Robert Finch, who worked as a transportation coordinator at Mountain Vista. His job was to drive new admissions to the facility and occasionally transport residents to outside appointments." She clicked to a new image, a driver's license photo of a man in his 30s with thinning brown hair and pale eyes. He looked ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of face that would disappear in a crowd. "Finch had a white cargo van that he used for facility business," Agent Torres continued. "On June 15, 1991, the day before your husband and son were last confirmed to be alive, Finch called in sick to work. He didn't return until June 18th, claiming he'd had the flu." The dates made Helen's stomach turn. June 15th to June 18th, the exact window when David and Owen had vanished. "We pulled employment records from the facility's archives," Detective Reeves added. "Finch was flagged multiple times by other staff members for inappropriate behavior with the youth residents. There were complaints that he made the children uncomfortable, that he showed excessive interest in certain boys. But the facility's administration never filed formal reports or involved outside authorities." "Where is he now?" Claire asked. "This Robert Finch?" Agent Torres's expression darkened. "That's the complicated part. Robert Finch died in 1998, 6 years after your family disappeared. He was killed in what was ruled a single-vehicle accident on a rural highway in Idaho, but there are aspects of that accident that are now being reviewed as potentially suspicious." Helen's mind raced, trying to fit the pieces together. If this man killed David and took Owen, and then he died 6 years later, what happened to my son? "That's what we're trying to determine," Agent Torres said. "But there's more. We've started interviewing former staff and residents of Mountain Vista, and we've uncovered some disturbing patterns." She pulled up a document on the screen, a list of names with dates beside them. Between 1989 and 1994, 12 boys between the ages of 10 and 14 disappeared from the facility, or shortly after being released. The official explanations varied. Some were listed as runaways. Some supposedly went to live with relatives. some transferred to other facilities. But we can't confirm what actually happened to any of them. Helen stared at the list, horror building in her chest. You're saying this place was disappearing children? We're saying that children who should have been in a secure facility somehow vanished without adequate documentation or follow-up, Agent Torres clarified. And given what we now know about the abuse occurring there, we have to consider the possibility that something far more sinister was happening. Could Owen have been taken there? Helen asked. Could he have been held at Mountain Vista? Detective Reeves pulled up another document. We've obtained the facility's resident records. There's no Owen Pritchard listed, but there are gaps in the documentation, periods where the records are incomplete or obviously falsified. The facility was chaotic, deliberately so in some cases to cover up what was really happening. We're also looking at the possibility that Owen was held somewhere else, Agent Torres added. Robert Finch had a property in his name, a rural cabin about 15 miles from the facility. We're arranging to search it, though after 26 years and multiple changes of ownership, we're not optimistic about finding physical evidence. Helen stood abruptly and walked to the window, her hands shaking. Behind her, she heard Claire asking questions, heard the agents responding with clinical precision, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Her mind was filled with images she couldn't shake. Owen being driven away in a white van, terrified and injured, his father dead behind him. Owen being taken to some isolated place, held captive by a man who preyed on children. Mrs. Pritchard, Agent Torres said gently, joining her at the window. I know this is overwhelming, but for the first time in 33 years, we have a viable suspect and a clear timeline. We're following every lead, interviewing everyone connected to Mountain Vista, examining every record. We will find out what happened to Owen. He's dead, isn't he? Helen said, her voice flat. Even if he survived the initial abduction, even if he was alive for days or weeks or months after that, he's been dead for years. That's what you're thinking. Agent Torres didn't insult her with false reassurance. Statistically, yes, the likelihood of Owen being alive today is extremely low. But I've been doing this work for 25 years, Mrs. Pritchard, and I've learned never to assume anything. We've had cases where people we thought were long dead turned out to be alive, living under different names, sometimes held captive for decades. Elizabeth Smart, Claire said from behind them. J.C. Dugard. They were found alive after years. Exactly, Agent Torres said. So we investigate as if Owen could still be alive, even while we prepare for the more likely scenario. We owe you that, and we owe Owen that. Helen turned back to the room. I want to see the facility, Mountain Vista. I want to see where this man worked. It's been abandoned for 30 years, Detective Reeves cautioned. The buildings are condemned, potentially dangerous. I don't care, Helen said. Someone from that place killed my husband and took my son. I need to see it. Agent Torres exchanged glances with Detective Reeves, then nodded. All right. We'll arrange a supervised visit. The site is part of an active investigation now anyway. But Mrs. Pritchard, I need you to understand that what you see there might be disturbing. The reports from the 1994 raid describe conditions that were appalling even before the place was abandoned. I've lived with disturbing images in my head for 33 years, Helen said. Whatever I see can't be worse than what I've imagined. But she was wrong about that, as she would discover the next morning when they drove through the gates of Mountain Vista Youth Services, and Helen came face to face with the place where nightmares had been manufactured, where children had been broken and disappeared, where the trail of her missing son led into darkness deeper than she'd ever imagined possible. The afternoon wore on as the agents continued briefing them on what they'd discovered. There were photographs of the facility in its operational days, images that looked benign enough on the surface. Clean buildings, organized grounds, smiling staff in promotional materials. But underneath the veneer, something rotten had festered. The director, a man named Gerald Marsh, ran the facility like a personal fiefdom, Agent Torres explained. He hired staff who wouldn't ask questions, who were loyal to him above any ethical or legal considerations. Many of them had prior complaints or even criminal records that should have disqualified them from working with children. She pulled up a group photograph, clearly from some facility event. 24 staff members posed in front of the main building. Agent Torres pointed to Robert Finch, standing in the back row, his expression blank and his eyes somehow empty even in the still photograph. Finch was hired in 1989, Agent Torres said. He had no previous experience in youth services, no relevant education or training. But he had a clean driving record and was willing to work for low wages. Marsh didn't conduct any meaningful background check. What happened to Marsh? Claire asked. After the facility was shut down? He served 8 years in federal prison for fraud, child abuse, and obstruction of justice, Agent Torres said. He was released in 2002 and died of a heart attack in 2010. We've reviewed every piece of testimony and evidence from his trial, and there's no mention of Robert Finch or any connection to missing children from outside the facility. Marsh was prosecuted for what happened to the children whose parents had placed them there, not for abductions. So whatever Finch was doing, he was doing it separately from the facility's official operation, Helen said. That's our theory, Agent Torres confirmed. He may have been using his position and access to the facility as cover for his own crimes. The chaos and lack of oversight at Mountain Vista would have made it easy for him to bring in a child who wasn't officially on the books, especially if that child was injured or traumatized into compliance. Detective Reeves added, "We're also looking into Finch's associates, people he was close to in the years before his death. There's a possibility he wasn't acting alone, that he had help hiding and potentially disposing of evidence." Helen felt sick. Every new piece of information revealed depths of depravity she hadn't wanted to imagine. David had pulled over to help what seemed like a stranded traveler, probably a man with a child who appeared to need assistance. It would have been exactly like David to stop, to offer a ride, to try to help. And that kindness had led him and Owen into the hands of a predator. "I want to talk to the other families," Helen said suddenly. "The families of the 12 boys who disappeared from Mountain Vista. Maybe if we compare cases, we'll find patterns, connections." Agent Torres looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Pritchard, many of those families are difficult to locate. These were often troubled kids from broken homes, which is why they ended up at places like Mountain Vista in the first place. Parents who've lost track of their children, family situations that have dissolved or become unreachable over time." "But some of them must be findable," Helen insisted. "Someone must have kept looking for their sons, the way I looked for Owen." "We're working on it," Agent Torres assured her. "But I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that we may never find all the answers. Robert Finch is dead. Many of the staff from Mountain Vista are dead or untraceable. The facility's records are incomplete. After 33 years, some truths may simply be beyond recovery." Helen met her eyes steadily. "I've waited 33 years already. I can wait longer if I have to, but I won't stop until I know what happened to my son." As they left the police headquarters that evening, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It would have been beautiful under other circumstances, but Helen saw only the darkness gathering in the valleys, shadows lengthening across the landscape where her family had been destroyed. Claire drove them back to the hotel in silence. In the lobby, Helen stopped at the business center and requested access to a computer. She spent the next 3 hours searching for information about Mountain Vista Youth Services, reading every article about the 1994 raid, every court document available online, every fragment of information about the facility that had trained its staff to hurt children. And she made a list. 12 names of boys who had disappeared. 12 families who might have answers or questions that matched her own. 12 threads that might lead back to Robert Finch and what he'd done to Owen Pritchard on a Montana highway in June of 1991. By the time Helen finally went to bed, it was after midnight. But she didn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, thinking about Owen carved into a tree trunk, about a bloody sneaker and a torn shirt buried separately as if whoever had hidden them couldn't quite decide what to do with the evidence. She thought about Robert Finch's dead eyes in the photograph, about the white van he'd driven, about the cabin where he might have taken her son, and she thought about tomorrow when she would walk through the ruins of Mountain Vista Youth Services and try to find some trace of Owen in that terrible place. The nightmare was taking shape, becoming real, more horrible than anything she'd imagined during 33 years of not knowing. But at least now she was moving forward, following the trail her son had left behind, no matter where it led or what horrors she would find at the end of it. The gates of Mountain Vista Youth Services hung crooked on rusted hinges, chain-link fencing overtaken by 3 decades of invasive vegetation. A faded sign still clung to the entrance, its cheerful painted letters promising a new beginning for troubled youth. Someone had spray-painted over it years ago, crude words Helen didn't want to read. Detective Reeves pulled the patrol vehicle through the gate, followed by an FBI van carrying Agent Torres and 2 other investigators. The gravel drive was cracked and broken, weeds pushing through everywhere, nature slowly reclaiming what humans had abandoned. Helen sat in the passenger seat, Claire behind her, both women silent as the compound came into view. 4 large buildings arranged in a square around an overgrown courtyard. The structures were institutional brick, 2 stories each, their windows either broken or covered with plywood. Graffiti covered the lower walls, and the roofs sagged ominously in places. The main building housed administration and common areas, Detective Reeves said, pointing to the structure directly ahead. The 2 wings on either side were dormitories. The building in back was the infirmary and isolation rooms. Isolation rooms. Helen's stomach turned at the clinical phrase. She'd read the court documents from the 1994 raid. The isolation rooms had been places where children were locked in darkness for days at a time as punishment. Some of the survivors testified about being restrained, denied food, subjected to psychological torture disguised as therapeutic intervention. They parked in what had once been the main lot. The asphalt was barely visible beneath accumulated dirt and plant matter. As Helen climbed out of the vehicle, she caught a smell on the wind, something dank and rotten, like the earth itself was diseased here. Agent Torres emerged from the FBI van wearing a heavy jacket and carrying a flashlight despite the morning sun. "Stay close to the group," she instructed. "These buildings are structurally unsound. Don't touch anything, don't wander off, and if I say we're leaving, we leave immediately." 2 FBI technicians began unpacking equipment from the van: cameras, lights, metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar. This wasn't just a visit for Helen's benefit. They were conducting a thorough search of the facility, looking for evidence that might connect to Owen or the other missing boys. Helen followed Agent Torres toward the main building, stepping carefully over debris and broken concrete. The front doors hung open, one completely off its hinges. Inside, the entrance hall was dim and musty. Water damage had turned the walls black with mold. Ceiling tiles had collapsed, creating a treacherous obstacle course of rubble and twisted metal framework. The administrative offices were through here, Agent Torres said, leading them down a corridor lined with broken doorways. She shone her flashlight into each room as they passed. Offices stripped bare, filing cabinets overturned and empty, desks vandalized and left to rot. They entered what had been the director's office. It was larger than the others, with windows overlooking the courtyard. Someone had spray-painted symbols on the walls, and the floor was littered with beer cans and evidence of squatters or teenagers who'd used the abandoned facility as a party spot over the years. "Gerald Marsh sat here and ran his empire," Agent Torres said, her voice echoing in the empty room. "He decided which children got isolated, which staff members got hired, which complaints got ignored. Everything that happened here flowed from this office." Helen walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard. She could almost see it as it had been. Children being marched between buildings, supervised by staff who viewed them as problems to be managed rather than young people who needed help. Had Owen been here? Had he stood in this courtyard, terrified and alone, looking for escape? "The dormitories are this way," Detective Reeves said, leading them back through the main building and toward the east wing. The dormitory building was worse than the administration block. The stairwell stank of urine and decay. On the second floor, they found what had been sleeping quarters, long rooms lined with metal bed frames, mattresses long since removed or rotted away. Small lockers stood open and empty. The windows were barred, Helen noticed. Not just covered, but actually barred, as if the children housed here had been prisoners. Each room held 12 residents, Agent Torres explained. No privacy, no personal space. Bathroom facilities were communal and located at the end of the hall. Staff monitored the dormitories 24 hours a day, supposedly for safety. But the survivors reported it felt more like surveillance. Claire walked between the bed frames, her hand trailing along the rusted metal. "These kids were sent here by their parents," she said quietly. "People who were supposed to love and protect them sent them to this place. Most of them had behavioral issues, mental health problems, addiction struggles," Agent Torres said. "Their families were desperate, and places like Mountain Vista promised miracles. The reality was very different from the marketing materials." They continued through the dormitory, Helen's horror growing with each room they entered. She saw scratches on the walls where children had carved their names or counted days. She saw stains on the floors that could have been anything. She saw the bars on windows and the heavy locks on doors, and she understood with crushing certainty that this place had been designed to break children, not heal them. The isolation rooms were in the basement of the infirmary building. Agent Torres hesitated at the top of the stairs leading down, her flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow the light. "Mrs. Pritchard, you don't have to see this part," she said gently. "It's going to be disturbing." "I need to see everything," Helen replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. The stairs descended into cold darkness. The basement had no windows, and the air was thick with moisture and rot. The FBI technicians had set up portable lights, harsh white illumination that revealed a corridor lined with metal doors. There were 8 isolation cells, Agent Torres said. Children were locked in here for days, sometimes weeks, with minimal food and water, no contact with others, no light. The psychological damage was catastrophic. Helen approached the nearest door. It was heavy steel with a small window at eye level, the glass reinforced with wire mesh. She looked through the window into a cell perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet. Nothing inside except concrete walls, a drain in the floor, and darkness so complete it seemed solid. "They called it therapeutic isolation," Agent Torres said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They claimed it gave troubled youth time to reflect on their behavior and reset their attitudes. What it actually did was traumatize already vulnerable children even further." Helen moved from cell to cell, looking through each window into the darkness beyond. At the 4th cell, her flashlight beam caught something scratched into the concrete wall inside. She squinted, trying to make it out. "Can we open this door?" she asked. Agent Torres unlocked it with a key provided by the local sheriff's department. The door swung open with a rusty groan, and Helen stepped into the cell, her flashlight focused on the wall. Words had been scratched into the concrete, crude and desperate. "I want to go home. Please someone help me." Below the words were tally marks, dozens of them, someone counting days in the darkness. "We're documenting everything," Agent Torres said softly. "Every message, every mark. These children deserve to have their suffering acknowledged, even if it's 30 years too late." Helen backed out of the cell, unable to bear the claustrophobic space any longer. She thought about Owen, about whether he'd been brought here, whether he'd been locked in one of these boxes. The thought made her physically ill. They continued the tour, each area more disturbing than the last. The infirmary where children had been forcibly medicated, the cafeteria where food had been withheld as punishment, the recreation yard where wire fencing 15 feet high had prevented any possibility of escape. As they prepared to leave the infirmary building, one of the FBI technicians called out, "Agent Torres, you need to see this." They followed him to a storage room at the back of the building. The technician had moved aside several collapsed shelving units, revealing a door that had been hidden behind them. The door was locked with a heavy padlock, newer than anything else they'd seen in the facility. "This lock is maybe 10 years old," the technician said. "Someone was here recently enough to secure this room." Agent Torres examined the lock, then turned to Detective Reeves. "Can we get bolt cutters?" 10 minutes later, they cut through the padlock and opened the door. The room beyond was small and windowless, maybe 12 feet square. And unlike every other room in the facility, this one wasn't empty. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their drawers still intact. Boxes were stacked in a corner, their contents protected from the decay that had consumed the rest of the building. Someone had preserved this room, kept it sealed and dry while everything around it rotted. Agent Torres pulled open the nearest filing cabinet drawer. Inside were personnel files, organized alphabetically. She pulled one out and opened it, scanning the contents. "These are employee records," she said, excitement creeping into her voice. "Complete records, including background checks, performance reviews, incident reports." She looked up at Helen. "Everything we couldn't find in the official archives. Someone hid these here." The FBI technicians immediately began photographing and cataloging the contents. Agent Torres pulled files for Robert Finch, Gerald Marsh, and several other names Helen recognized from the investigation. As she read through them, her expression grew darker. "Finch had multiple complaints filed against him," she said. "Inappropriate contact with male residents, suspicious absences, violations of transportation protocols. He was reprimanded 7 times in 3 years, but never fired." She flipped through more pages. "And there are notes here about his van. Several residents reported that Finch's van had been modified with a cage in the back, that he'd transport boys in the cage rather than letting them sit in regular seats." Helen felt lightheaded. A cage in a van. Had Owen been transported in a cage, treated like an animal, after watching his father be murdered? "There's more," Agent Torres said, pulling files from another drawer. "These aren't personnel files. These are resident files for children who weren't in the official records. Look at this." She handed Helen a folder. Inside was a photograph of a teenage boy, maybe 13 years old, with dark hair and frightened eyes. Beneath the photo was a name. Not a real name, Helen was certain. Subject M7. Below that were dates and notes in someone's tight handwriting, clinical observations about the boy's behavior, his responses to discipline, his progress in reconditioning. "There are 12 of these files," Agent Torres said, her voice shaking slightly. 12 boys with designation numbers instead of names. The dates match the time frame when children were reported missing from the facility. Helen's hands trembled as she looked through the files. 12 boys. 12 families who would never know what happened to their sons. These children had been erased, reduced to subject numbers, their humanity stripped away. "Is Owen in here?" Claire asked, her voice small. Agent Torres carefully went through each file, checking photographs and dates. Helen held her breath, part of her hoping to find Owen in these files because it would mean answers, part of her praying he wasn't there because the implications were too horrible. "No," Agent Torres said finally. "None of these boys match Owen's description or date of disappearance, but that doesn't mean Finch didn't take him. It might mean Owen was held somewhere else, not at the facility." "The cabin," Helen said. "You mentioned Finch had a cabin." "Yes. We're executing a search warrant there tomorrow. But Mrs. Pritchard, that cabin has had 4 different owners since Finch died. The chances of finding evidence after 26 years are slim." As the FBI technicians continued documenting the hidden room, Helen walked back through the facility one last time. In the daylight filtering through broken windows, Mountain Vista Youth Services looked like exactly what it was, a place where nightmares had been manufactured, where vulnerable children had been broken and destroyed, where a man like Robert Finch had been able to operate with impunity while wearing the mask of a legitimate employee. Owen had been 12 years old, the same age as many of the boys in those files. Helen thought about the bloody shirt buried near the ravine, about the carved message in the tree, about the single sneaker that suggested Owen had been here, in this landscape of horror 33 years ago. As they left the facility and passed back through the rusted gates, Helen looked back at the buildings one final time. Whatever had happened to Owen, it had started on a highway when David had stopped to help someone in need. But it had led here, to this terrible place, to people who saw children as objects to be used and discarded. The question that haunted her now was simpler and more terrible than all the mysteries they'd uncovered. Had Owen died quickly, or had he endured months or years of the horror these files documented? Had mercy been granted, or had her son suffered in ways no child should ever suffer? Helen didn't know which answer she hoped to find, but she knew she would keep searching until she found one. The cabin was located deep in the Bitterroot National Forest, accessible only by a dirt road that branched off a rarely used Forest Service route. Helen and Claire followed Detective Reeves's patrol vehicle in their rental car, Agent Torres and her team in a convoy behind them. The October morning was cold, frost still clinging to shaded areas, the sky a pale gray that promised snow before nightfall. After 40 minutes of rough driving, they emerged into a small clearing. The cabin sat at the center, a small log structure with a sagging roof and boarded windows. A detached shed stood behind it, its door hanging crooked. The forest pressed close on all sides, towering pines that blocked out much of the sky. Finch bought this property in 1990, Agent Torres said as they gathered near the vehicles. The year before your husband and son disappeared. He paid cash, which was unusual for someone making his salary. We're still trying to trace where that money came from. Helen stared at the cabin. It looked innocent enough, just another neglected mountain property. But she could feel something wrong about it, some quality of the place that made her skin crawl. The FBI technicians began unloading equipment. Ground-penetrating radar would be used to search the property for buried remains. Cadaver dogs were being brought in from Missoula, scheduled to arrive within the hour. The cabin itself would be searched top to bottom, every inch documented and processed. The current owner gave us full permission to search, Detective Reeves explained. He bought the place in 2015, never lived here, just considered it an investment. He had no idea about its history. As the technicians set up, Helen and Claire were asked to wait by the vehicles. Helen couldn't take her eyes off the cabin. Had Owen been here? Had he been held in that small structure, miles from help, unable to escape? An FBI technician approached the front door with a crowbar. The boards came away easily, wood rotted from years of exposure. The door itself was unlocked, swinging open to reveal darkness within. Agent Torres entered first, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Helen watched from outside as lights were set up, generators humming to life. After several minutes, Agent Torres emerged, her expression grim. "Mrs. Pritchard, there's something inside I think you should see," she said carefully. "But I need to warn you, it's going to be difficult." Helen didn't hesitate. She walked to the cabin and stepped through the doorway, Claire close behind her. The interior was a single large room, with a small kitchen area in one corner and a loft accessible by a ladder. The furniture that remained was basic: a table, 2 chairs, a rusted metal bed frame with no mattress. The walls were bare logs, and the floor was rough planking that had warped over the years, but it was the wall at the back of the cabin that made Helen's breath catch. Dozens of photographs were tacked to the wood, curling with age and moisture damage. Helen approached slowly, her heart pounding. The photographs were of boys, children between roughly 10 and 15 years old, all of them looking at the camera with expressions ranging from fear to vacant emptiness. Some of the photos appeared to have been taken outside in wooded settings. Others were clearly taken inside this very cabin based on the log wall backgrounds. "We're documenting each photograph," Agent Torres said quietly. "We'll work to identify these children and determine if they match any missing persons reports." Helen studied each face, searching for Owen. She saw boys with dark hair, blonde hair, red hair. She saw thin faces and round faces, tall boys and short boys, but she didn't see Owen. Her son's distinctive features, David's strong jaw, her own wide-set eyes, the gap between his front teeth that he'd been self-conscious about, weren't in any of these photographs. "He's not here," she said, relief and disappointment mingling in her voice. "Not in the photographs we can see," Agent Torres agreed. "But there may be others. And there are other things here, Mrs. Pritchard. Evidence that this cabin was used for exactly what we feared." She led Helen to a corner of the room where an FBI technician was carefully examining the floor. Several boards had been pried up, revealing a space beneath. "There's a crawl space under the cabin," the technician explained. "About 3 feet deep. We found items hidden down there." He held up an evidence bag containing what appeared to be children's clothing, a small jacket, torn and stained with dark patches that were probably blood. Another bag held a child's watch, its battery long dead. A third bag contained something that made Helen's knees weak, a small wallet with cartoon characters on it, the kind a child might own. "We're cataloging everything," Agent Torres said. "Each item will be tested for DNA and compared against missing persons databases. It's going to take time, but we will identify these children." Helen turned away, unable to look at the evidence any longer. She walked to the cabin's one window, looking out at the forest beyond. How many children had stood at this window, looking out at trees that offered no escape, no hope? Claire was examining the photographs on the wall, her face pale. "Agent Torres," she called out. "This one. This boy looks familiar." Agent Torres joined her, and Helen turned back to see what Claire had found. It was a photograph near the corner, partially hidden by others. The boy in it was perhaps 13, with dark curly hair and a thin face. He wore a T-shirt with a logo Helen couldn't quite make out. "Wait," Detective Reeves said, pulling out her phone. She scrolled through images, then held it up next to the photograph. It was one of the files they'd found at Mountain Vista, the boy designated Subject M4. "It's the same child," Claire said. "This cabin was connected to whatever was happening at the facility." "Finch was bringing boys here," Agent Torres said, her voice tight. "Boys from Mountain Vista and possibly others like Owen who he encountered and abducted. This was his private place, where he could do whatever he wanted without oversight." One of the FBI technicians called from the loft. "You need to see this." They climbed the ladder to find the loft space even more disturbing than the main room. A single mattress lay on the floor, stained and rotting. But it was the walls that drew their attention. Someone had carved into the wood hundreds of marks and messages, names, dates, pleas for help, the desperate scratching of children trying to leave some record of their existence. Helen read the carvings with growing horror. "Help me. I want my mom. Please, God, make it stop." And there, near the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, Owen P. was here. Helen's legs gave out. She sank to her knees, staring at the carving. Owen's name. Her son had been in this loft, had carved his name into this wall, had tried to leave evidence that he'd existed. "We're documenting this," Agent Torres said quickly, cameras already flashing as technicians photographed the carving. "Mrs. Pritchard, this confirms Owen was brought to this location. It's the first direct evidence we have of where he was after leaving the ravine." Helen reached out to touch the letters carved into the wood, her fingers tracing the shape of her son's name. He'd been here, terrified and alone, held captive by a monster. How long had he been in this cabin? Days? Weeks? The carving was weathered enough to suggest it had been here for decades, which meant Owen had survived at least long enough to leave this message. "There's a date," Claire said, pointing to numbers carved below Owen's name. 691, June 1991. Shortly after the abduction, Detective Reeves noted. He was brought here almost immediately. Outside, the sound of barking announced the arrival of the cadaver dogs. Helen climbed down from the loft, needing to escape the oppressive atmosphere of that space. She stood outside the cabin, breathing cold mountain air, trying to process what they'd found. The dogs worked methodically, their handlers guiding them around the property in careful grids. Helen watched, dreading and anticipating what they might find. If they found remains, it would mean Owen was dead. But at least she'd know. At least she could bring him home, bury him next to David. give them both the peace they deserved. But the dogs found nothing. They alerted near the shed. An excavation revealed animal bones, probably deer or elk that had died naturally and been scavenged. They alerted near the tree line, but digging found only old trash buried by a previous owner. No human remains, no evidence that anyone had been buried on the property. It doesn't mean he wasn't killed here, Agent Torres explained as the afternoon wore on. Bodies can be transported. Finch had a van and knew the forest. He could have disposed of remains miles from here. As the search continued, Helen explored the property, staying out of the investigators' way but unable to simply wait passively. Behind the shed, she found evidence that multiple vehicles had once parked there. Tire ruts worn deep into the earth, oil stains, scattered debris. A path led from the parking area into the woods, just wide enough for a person to walk. She followed the path, ignoring Agent Torres's call for her to stay close. The path wound through the trees for perhaps 100 yards before opening onto a larger clearing. In the center was a fire pit, cold and long abandoned. Around it were scattered metal poles driven into the ground, and Helen realized with horror that they'd had chains attached to them once. The chains were gone now, but the rust marks remained. "Mrs. Pritchard, you shouldn't be out here alone," Agent Torres said, catching up to her. Helen pointed to the poles. "What is this?" Agent Torres studied the scene, her expression darkening. "I don't know, but we're going to process this area as part of the crime scene." They called the technicians over, and cameras began flashing again. As Helen watched the documentation process, she noticed something else, marks on several of the trees surrounding the clearing. She approached the nearest one and found more carvings, similar to those in the cabin loft. These carvings were different, though. These were dates and numbers, arranged in columns. It looked like someone keeping a record, tallying something. Helen traced the marks with her finger, trying to understand what they meant. "Agent Torres," she called, "what are these?" The agent examined the carvings, her face going pale. "I think someone was keeping count, recording how many children were brought here, how long they stayed." They found similar tallies on 3 other trees around the clearing. The numbers went back years, starting in what appeared to be 1990, when Finch had bought the property, and continuing through 1998. Finch died in 1998, Detective Reeves noted. The tallies stopped then. "How many?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. "How many children did he bring here?" Agent Torres counted carefully, marking each tally on her notepad. When she finished, her voice was hollow. "Based on these marks, at least 47 children were brought to this location over 8 years. The number hung in the air like a curse. 47 children, 12 from Mountain Vista who'd been documented in those hidden files. Owen, and dozens more who'd never been reported, never been searched for, simply vanished from families that perhaps hadn't cared enough to look. "Where are they?" Helen asked. 47 children can't just disappear. "Some may have survived," Agent Torres said carefully. "Finch might have released some, possibly after convincing them no one would believe their stories or that their families didn't want them back. Others may have been killed and their remains disposed of in places we haven't found yet. And some," she paused, "some may have been trafficked to others. There's evidence that Mountain Vista had connections to a larger network of facilities and individuals who exploited vulnerable children." Helen thought about Owen, about whether he'd been one of the lucky ones who survived, or whether his body lay somewhere in these vast forests, never to be found. The carving in the cabin proved he'd been alive in June 1991, but what had happened after that? Had he lived days, months, years, or had he died quickly, spared the prolonged horror that some of the other children might have endured? As the sun began to set and investigators prepared to conclude the day's search, Helen stood in the clearing one last time. The poles with their rust-marked chains stood like grave markers, monuments to children who'd suffered here. The trees with their terrible tallies bore witness to years of horror that no one had stopped, no one had discovered until now. "We'll come back tomorrow," Agent Torres promised as they prepared to leave. We're bringing more equipment, more dogs, more personnel. We're going to search every inch of this forest until we find answers." But Helen knew that even if they found every missing piece of evidence, even if they identified every child and solved every disappearance, nothing would change the fundamental truth. Owen had been here, had suffered here, had carved his name in the wall of a monster's cabin because he knew no one was coming to save him. And Helen hadn't known. For 33 years, she'd been searching in the wrong places, following the wrong leads, while the truth lay hidden in this forest, in a cabin that had witnessed unspeakable things. As they drove away from the property, darkness falling fast in the mountain valley, Helen looked back one last time. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, just a dark shape against the deepening night. But she would carry the image of it with her forever. The photographs on the wall, the carving in the loft, the chains in the clearing. This was where her son's trail led. This was where the nightmare had continued after David's murder. And somewhere beyond this cabin, somewhere in the vast wilderness or in records they hadn't yet found, lay the final answer to what had happened to Owen Pritchard. Helen was closer than she'd ever been to the truth. But the truth, when it finally came, might be more than she could bear to know. The break in the case came 3 days later from an unexpected source. Helen and Claire were still in Montana, staying at a small rental house in Missoula while the investigation continued. The FBI had expanded their search, bringing in additional agents, more cadaver dogs, and specialized forensic equipment. The cabin and surrounding forest were being treated as a major crime scene, with teams working 12-hour shifts to process every inch of the property. Helen spent her days at the police station, reviewing evidence, looking at photographs, trying to find patterns in the horror that had been uncovered. She'd become obsessed with the tallies carved into the trees, trying to match them to missing persons reports, to unsolved disappearances of children from across the Northwest. It was late afternoon when Detective Reeves called Helen into a conference room where Agent Torres waited with a man Helen had never seen before. He was in his 70s, with white hair and weathered features, dressed in worn flannel and work boots. His hands trembled slightly as he held a coffee cup. "Mrs. Pritchard, this is Walter Henning," Agent Torres said. "He contacted us this morning after seeing news coverage of the investigation. Mr. Henning has information about Robert Finch." Helen sat down across from the old man, her heart racing. "You knew him?" Walter nodded, his eyes sad and tired. "I was the property manager for the National Forest sector where Finch's cabin was located. I worked that area from 1985 until I retired in 2003. I saw Finch up there more times than I could count." "Did you ever suspect what he was doing?" Helen asked, trying to keep accusation out of her voice. "Not at first," Walter said heavily. "Finch told me he was running a private counseling retreat for troubled boys, connected to Mountain Vista. Said he was helping kids who needed time away from the facility, giving them nature experiences to help with their rehabilitation. I had no reason to doubt him. He seemed normal, professional." "But something changed," Agent Torres prompted. Walter set down his coffee cup, his hands shaking worse now. "Summer of 1993. I was doing a routine patrol of the Forest Service roads, checking for illegal camping or fire hazards. I came up the road to Finch's cabin unannounced, which I'd never done before. Usually I'd call ahead if I was going to check on his property." He paused, his face paling at the memory. There was a boy outside the cabin, maybe 14 years old, thin as a rail, bruised, looked like he hadn't eaten in days. He was chained to one of those poles we found in the clearing, just sitting there in the dirt. When he saw my truck, he started screaming for help. Helen's breath caught. "What did you do?" "Finch came running out of the cabin before I could get to the boy. He was all apologies, explaining that this was one of his clients who had severe behavioral problems, that the restraint was a last resort therapeutic intervention approved by the boy's parents and doctors. He had paperwork, official-looking documents from Mountain Vista authorizing the treatment." Walter's voice broke. "I believed him. God help me. I believed him because I wanted to. It was easier than accepting what I was really seeing, Finch convinced me this was all legitimate, all part of some treatment program I didn't understand. He asked me to leave, said my presence was disrupting the therapeutic process, and I left. "Did you report what you saw?" Detective Reeves asked. Walter shook his head, tears in his eyes. "No, I didn't report it. I told myself it was being handled by professionals, that it wasn't my place to interfere. But I knew, deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to deal with it." Helen felt a surge of anger, but looking at the old man's anguished face, she couldn't sustain it. He'd been manipulated by Finch just like everyone else, his trust exploited, his willingness to believe authority figures used against him. "Mr. Henning came to us because he wants to help," Agent Torres said. "He's been carrying this guilt for 30 years. When he saw the news coverage and learned what Finch had really been doing, he knew he had to speak up." "I should have saved that boy," Walter said, looking directly at Helen. "I should have saved all of them. I'm so sorry for what happened to your son." "The boy you saw," Helen said carefully. "Do you remember what he looked like?" Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I drew this last night. I'm not much of an artist, but I've never forgotten his face." He unfolded the paper to reveal a pencil sketch. It was crude but clear enough. A thin face, dark hair, wide, frightened eyes. The boy in the drawing was definitely a teenager, older than Owen had been when he was taken. "That's not Owen," Helen said, disappointment and relief mixing in her chest. "My son was 12, blonde hair, smaller build." Walter nodded. "I didn't think it was. But after I saw that boy in 1993, I started paying more attention to Finch's property. I'd drive by more often, watch from a distance. I saw other children over the years, always boys, always looking scared and beaten down. I saw Finch's van coming and going, and I did nothing." "How many?" Agent Torres asked. "How many different boys did you see?" "At least a dozen over the 5 years between when I saw the chained boy and when Finch died. Maybe more. They'd be there for a few weeks or months, then they'd be gone and new ones would appear." "Did you ever see what happened to them when they left?" Walter shook his head. "No. Finch was careful. He'd only move them at night or when he knew I wasn't patrolling, but..." He hesitated. "There was one time, fall of 1997, when I was camping in a remote area about 10 miles from Finch's cabin. I was trying to track a report of illegal logging. Around midnight, I heard a vehicle on one of the old mining roads, which was strange because those roads weren't maintained and weren't supposed to be used." He took a shaky breath. "I hiked toward the sound and saw Finch's van parked near an abandoned mine shaft, one of the old copper mines from the early 1900s, boarded up and marked dangerous. Finch was there with another man, someone I didn't recognize. They were lowering something down into the mine shaft, something wrapped in a tarp." The room went completely silent. Helen felt ice spreading through her veins. "I should have stopped them," Walter continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have called the police right then. But I was scared. These men were disposing of something in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. If they'd known I was watching, I think they would have killed me too." "Did you ever go back to that mine?" Detective Reeves asked. "No, I was too afraid. And after Finch died in 1998, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that it was just trash they were dumping illegally, not what I feared it was." Agent Torres was already pulling up maps on her computer. "Mr. Henning, can you show us exactly where this mine is located?" For the next hour, Walter worked with the FBI team to pinpoint the location. The mine was in an extremely remote area, accessible only by rough four-wheel drive roads that had degraded significantly over the past 27 years. It would require a major operation to reach it and safely explore it. "We'll organize a team for tomorrow," Agent Torres said. "Mr. Henning, we'll need you to guide us there." After Walter left, escorted by an FBI agent who would take his full statement, Helen sat with Claire in the conference room, both women trying to process what they'd learned. "That mine could have remains," Claire said quietly. Not just Owen, all the children who were brought to that cabin and never seen again. Helen nodded, unable to speak. The horror of what Walter had described was almost beyond comprehension. Finch hadn't just abused these children. He'd killed them and disposed of their bodies in an abandoned mine where they'd never be found, where they'd lie in darkness forever. "I need to go there," Helen said finally. "Tomorrow, when they search the mine. I need to be there." "Mom, they might not let you. It's going to be dangerous, and it's going to be traumatic." "I don't care." Helen's voice was steel. "If Owen is in that mine, I'm bringing him home. I've failed him for 33 years. I won't fail him now." Detective Reeves entered the room, her expression grave. "Mrs. Pritchard, I need to prepare you for what we might find tomorrow. If Walter Henning's testimony is accurate, that mine could contain the remains of multiple victims. The identification process could take months. DNA testing, forensic anthropology, dental records. It's going to be a long, difficult process." "I understand," Helen said, "but I'm going. You're not keeping me away from this." Agent Torres joined them. "The mine is on federal land, so we have full authority to search it. We're bringing in specialized cave rescue teams, structural engineers to assess the safety of the shaft, and forensic recovery experts. This is going to be one of the largest evidence recovery operations Montana has seen in decades." She looked at Helen with something like sympathy. "Mrs. Pritchard, if you insist on being there, you can be. But you'll have to stay outside the search perimeter. We can't have civilians in what's essentially a hazardous industrial site. But I promise you, if we find your son, you'll be the first to know." That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about the mine, about what Walter had seen, about Owen's body possibly lying at the bottom of a shaft for 27 years. She thought about all the other children who might be down there, forgotten by everyone except families who'd spent decades wondering and hoping and grieving. Around 3 in the morning, she got up and found the photograph she always carried, David and Owen beside the Explorer, both grinning, both alive, both unaware that in 3 days their lives would end on a Montana highway. She traced Owen's face with her finger, memorizing features she'd never forgotten, but had begun to fear she'd never see again, even in death. "I'm coming, sweetheart," she whispered to the photograph. "Mom's coming to bring you home." The convoy left Missoula at dawn, FBI vehicles, police trucks, a structural engineering team, cave rescue specialists, and a mobile forensics lab. Helen and Claire followed in their rental car, trailing the official vehicles as they wound deeper into the mountains. The journey took 3 hours, the last 2 on roads that barely deserved the name. They climbed into high country where early snow had already fallen, the landscape stark and beautiful and utterly remote. This was wilderness in its truest form, miles from civilization, the kind of place where a person could disappear forever. Walter Henning rode in the lead vehicle, guiding them through a maze of forgotten mining roads. Finally, around mid-morning, the convoy stopped at the end of a road that simply vanished into forest. "The mine is about half a mile from here," Agent Torres explained as everyone gathered. "We'll hike in with equipment. Mrs. Pritchard, Mrs. Chen, you'll wait here with Detective Reeves until we've assessed the site." Helen wanted to argue but knew it was futile. She watched as the team geared up, helmets, ropes, lights, detection equipment, body bags. The reality of what they might find hit her with fresh force. If Owen was in that mine, he'd been there for 27 years, since 1997 if Walter's timeline was correct. Whatever they recovered wouldn't look like her son anymore. The team disappeared into the forest following Walter. Helen and Claire waited with Detective Reeves and 2 other officers, the silence broken only by wind in the trees and the occasional squawk of radios as the search team reported their progress. "They've reached the mine shaft," Detective Reeves relayed after 45 minutes. "Engineers are assessing structural integrity now." Another hour passed. Helen paced, unable to sit still, her mind racing with scenarios and possibilities. What if Owen wasn't in the mine? What if Walter had been wrong about what he'd seen? What if they never found her son? "They're preparing to descend," Detective Reeves said, listening to her radio. "The shaft goes down about 80 feet before opening into a larger chamber. The engineers say it's unstable but navigable with proper precautions." Helen closed her eyes, praying to any god who might listen. "Let them find him. Let me bring him home. Let this nightmare finally end." Time crawled. The sun climbed higher, casting short shadows through the trees. Helen's phone buzzed with messages from friends and relatives back in Portland, people who'd been following the news coverage of the investigation. She ignored them all. Then Detective Reeves's radio crackled with urgent voices. She listened intently, her face going pale. "What is it?" Helen demanded. "What did they find?" Detective Reeves looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. "They've found remains, multiple individuals. They're beginning the recovery process now." Helen's legs went weak. Claire caught her arm, supporting her. "How many?" Claire asked. "They're not sure yet. The recovery team says the remains are commingled, that it's going to take time to separate and identify individuals. But Agent Torres estimates at least 8 to 10 victims based on what they can see so far. 8 to 10 children, thrown into a mine shaft like garbage, left to decay in darkness, while families searched and grieved and hoped. 2 more hours passed before the first body bag was brought out of the forest, then another, and another. Helen watched as the bags were loaded into the forensics vehicle, each one a child who'd been failed by every system meant to protect them. Agent Torres emerged from the forest, her face drawn with exhaustion and horror. She walked directly to Helen. "We found him," she said simply. "We found Owen." Helen couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "How do you know? How can you be sure?" One of the victims was wearing a belt with a name engraved on the buckle. A leather belt with silver buckle, engraved with Owen P. "Do you remember your son having a belt like that?" Helen's mind raced back through memories. "Yes," she whispered. "I gave it to him for his 12th birthday 3 months before they left on the trip. He wore it every day. He was so proud of it." Agent Torres nodded gently. "We're going to conduct full DNA analysis to confirm identity, but given the belt and the age of the remains consistent with a 12-year-old male, we're confident it's Owen. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Pritchard." The world seemed to tilt. Helen had known intellectually that Owen was almost certainly dead, but having confirmation, knowing where and how he'd ended, made it real in a way 33 years of uncertainty never had. "How did he die?" Helen asked, needing to know despite the pain it would cause. Agent Torres hesitated. "The forensic team will need to conduct a thorough examination, but preliminary observation suggests blunt force trauma to the skull. It would have been quick, Mrs. Pritchard. He wouldn't have suffered long." Quick. A small mercy in an ocean of horror. Owen had been murdered, probably by Finch or the unknown accomplice Walter had seen that night in 1997. Her son had survived for 6 years after his father's death, held captive in that cabin, enduring things Helen couldn't bear to imagine. And then, when he was 18 years old, he'd been killed and thrown into a mine shaft. "The other victims," Claire asked. "Have you identified any of them?" "Not yet. We're bringing all remains to the forensics lab in Missoula for full analysis. It's going to take time: DNA extraction and comparison, dental records, forensic reconstruction. But we will identify every child in that mine. They all deserve to have their names back, to be returned to their families." As the recovery operation continued into the afternoon, Helen stood at the edge of the forest, staring toward where the mine lay hidden. Her son had spent 6 years in captivity, 6 years of horror she would never fully understand, and then he'd been killed and hidden in the earth, erased as if he'd never existed. But Owen had existed. He'd been a bright, energetic 12-year-old who loved fishing and baseball and his father's terrible jokes. He'd been her baby, her son, her heart walking around outside her body. and now she was finally bringing him home. The forensics team finished their work as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and red. 11 body bags were loaded into vehicles. 11 children who'd been stolen from their lives and families. 11 victims of Robert Finch and whoever had helped him. There's evidence in the mine that suggests Finch wasn't working alone, Agent Torres told Helen as they prepared to leave. Tools, clothing, items that belonged to multiple adults. We're analyzing everything, trying to identify his accomplices. The investigation isn't over, Mrs. Pritchard. We're going to find everyone involved in this. The drive back to Missoula was silent, a funeral procession winding through mountains that had hidden terrible secrets for decades. Helen watched the landscape pass by, thinking about Owen's last journey, the night he'd been brought to this remote place and thrown into darkness. But he wasn't in darkness anymore. He was coming home. Over the following days, the DNA analysis confirmed what the belt had suggested. The remains were Owen Pritchard, murdered in October 1997 at the age of 18. The forensic examination revealed he'd suffered multiple injuries over the years, evidence of prolonged abuse and captivity. But the fatal blow had been quick, a single strike to the skull that had likely caused immediate loss of consciousness and death within minutes. The other victims were gradually identified as well. Boys from Mountain Vista who'd been listed as runaways. Boys from troubled homes who'd been reported missing but whose cases had never been prioritized. Boys who'd simply vanished and been forgotten by a system that had failed them utterly. Among the identified victims was the boy Walter Henning had seen chained outside the cabin in 1993. His name was Marcus Webb, 14 years old when he'd been taken from a group home in Idaho. He'd been one of the 12 boys documented in the hidden files at Mountain Vista. The investigation expanded as forensic evidence from the mine revealed the identity of Finch's accomplice, a man named Leonard Drake, who had worked as a maintenance supervisor at Mountain Vista. Drake was found living in Wyoming under an assumed name. When FBI agents arrested him, they found a storage unit containing photographs, videos, and journals documenting decades of abuse and murder. Drake's arrest led to the identification of a larger network of predators who had used facilities like Mountain Vista as hunting grounds, sharing victims and information. The case exploded into one of the largest child abuse investigations in Northwestern history, with arrests spanning 4 states and involving more than 20 suspects. But for Helen, none of the larger investigation mattered as much as the simple fact that Owen was finally coming home. The cemetery in Portland was quiet on the October morning, exactly 1 year after Helen had received the call about the Silver Explorer being found in Montana. The trees blazed with autumn color, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. Helen stood before 2 graves side by side under an old oak tree. The headstones were simple gray granite, identical in size and style. David James Pritchard, 1956, 1991. Beloved husband and father Owen. David Pritchard, 1979, 1997. Beloved son and brother forever. 12 in our hearts, Helen placed fresh flowers on each grave. White roses for David because they'd been his favorite, and sunflowers for Owen because he'd always loved how they turned to follow the sun. Claire stood beside her mother, her own bouquet of flowers in hand. She'd been 3 years old when her father and brother disappeared. She had no real memories of them, just photographs and stories. But the past year had given her something she'd never had before: closure, understanding, and the ability to finally grieve properly. "I brought you both home," Helen said quietly to the graves. "It took 33 years, but I brought you home." The funeral had been 6 months ago, a private ceremony attended by family and the investigators who had worked to solve the case. David and Owen had been buried together, father and son reunited after decades apart. The service had been heartbreaking, but also, in its way, healing. Helen had finally been able to say goodbye. In the months since, the investigation had continued to unfold. Leonard Drake had pled guilty to multiple counts of murder and was serving consecutive life sentences. The other members of the network were being prosecuted one by one. Mountain Vista Youth Services and the systemic failures that had allowed it to operate had become the subject of legislative hearings and reform initiatives. Walter Henning had provided crucial testimony that led to several convictions. The old forest ranger had also established a foundation in honor of the victims, dedicated to protecting vulnerable children and reforming the troubled youth industry. It was, he'd told Helen, too little and too late, but it was something. The families of the other victims had also found closure, though closure seemed too neat a word for the complex grief of recovering a child's remains after decades. Helen had met several of them at victim advocacy meetings. They'd formed a kind of club no one wanted to belong to, united by shared tragedy and the terrible knowledge of what their children had endured. "Mom," Claire said gently, "we should probably go. You have that interview with the documentary team this afternoon." Helen nodded. She'd agreed to participate in a documentary about the case, hoping that publicity might help other families dealing with missing loved ones. If Owen's story could prevent even one child from being taken, could help even one family find answers, then maybe some good could come from the nightmare. As they walked back toward the parking lot, Helen looked back at the graves one final time. For 33 years, she'd lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn properly because she'd never known if David and Owen were alive or dead. Now she knew. The uncertainty was over. The truth had been worse than almost anything she'd imagined. David murdered on a highway while trying to help someone in need. Owen held captive for 6 years, abused and traumatized, before being killed and disposed of like trash. It was a horror beyond measure. But there was also something else, something she discovered in the carved messages Owen had left behind. Her son had never stopped fighting. He'd carved his name in the cabin wall, leaving evidence of his existence. He'd marked trees, left signs, tried to create a trail that might lead to rescue. Even at 18, after 6 years of captivity, Owen had still been trying to survive, still hoping someone would find him. He'd been braver than Helen could have imagined, stronger. He'd endured things no child should have to endure, and he'd kept fighting. That knowledge was both devastating and, in its own way, a source of bitter pride. "Do you think Dad tried to protect him?" Claire asked as they drove away from the cemetery. "When Finch attacked them?" "Yes," Helen said with absolute certainty. "Your father would have fought with everything he had to protect Owen. That's who he was." They drove in silence for a while, through the Portland streets Helen had lived on for 56 years. This city held her entire life: her marriage to David, Owen's childhood, Claire's upbringing, and the 3 decades of searching and grieving that had defined her existence. But now, finally, that chapter was closing. David and Owen were at rest. Their killers had been caught. The mystery that had consumed Helen's life had been solved. "What will you do now?" Claire asked, as if reading her mother's thoughts. "You've spent 33 years searching. What happens now that the search is over?" Helen thought about that. For so long, her identity had been tied to being the mother of a missing child, the wife of a murdered man. She'd defined herself by loss and the desperate hope of recovery. Now that Owen had been found and buried, who was she? "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I'll figure out how to live again. Really live, not just exist." They pulled into the driveway of Helen's house, the same house David and Owen had left from in June 1991. Helen had kept Owen's room exactly as he'd left it for 27 years, a shrine to hope. After the funeral, she'd finally begun to pack it up, sorting through a 12-year-old's possessions with tears streaming down her face. But she'd also kept some things out: Owen's baseball mitt, a photograph of him with the Little League team, the drawing he'd made of their family in art class the week before the trip. These items now sat in her living room, remembrances rather than desperate talismans. "I'm thinking about selling the house," Helen said suddenly. "There are too many ghosts here." Claire looked surprised but nodded. "Where would you go?" "I don't know. Somewhere new. Somewhere without memories of what I've lost." Helen paused. "Would you think I was crazy if I said I was considering Montana?" Montana? Really? I know it sounds strange, but something about those mountains, that landscape. It's where David and Owen ended, but it's also where I found them again. And there are all those other families dealing with the same things I've dealt with. Maybe I could help them. Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do with whatever time I have left. Claire reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. I think that sounds perfect, Mom. I think Dad and Owen would be proud of you. That afternoon, Helen sat for the documentary interview in her living room. The filmmaker asked about the day David and Owen had left, about the years of searching, about the phone call that had finally brought news. Helen answered honestly, holding nothing back, letting herself feel the grief and anger and eventual acceptance. What do you want people to understand about this case? The filmmaker asked near the end. Helen thought carefully before answering. I want people to understand that missing children don't just disappear. They're taken by someone, held by someone, sometimes killed by someone, and that someone is often hiding in plain sight, enabled by systems that don't ask enough questions or care enough about vulnerable children. I also want people to know that it's never too late to find answers. 33 years passed before we learned what happened to David and Owen. 3 decades. But the truth was still there, waiting to be discovered. Families shouldn't give up hope, but they also need support and resources and people who will keep searching even when cases go cold. And finally, Helen's voice broke slightly, I want people to remember the children, not just as victims, not just as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals. Owen was a 12-year-old boy who loved baseball and fishing. He was funny and smart and kind. He deserved to grow up, to have a life, to be happy. He deserved so much more than what happened to him. They all did. After the interview ended and the crew packed up their equipment, Helen sat alone in the living room as evening shadows lengthened. She looked at the photograph of Owen with his baseball mitt, at his bright smile and innocent eyes. I miss you every single day, she whispered to the photograph. But at least I know where you are now. At least you're with your father. At least you're home. Outside, autumn leaves drifted past the window, gold and red and orange, falling like tears from the trees. Another season changing, time moving forward as it always did, indifferent to human suffering and grief. But Helen was moving forward too, finally. Not forgetting, she would never forget, but learning to carry the grief instead of being crushed beneath it. Learning to honor David and Owen by living, by helping others, by making something meaningful from the ashes of tragedy. She thought about the mine in Montana, about the moment Owen's remains had been brought up from darkness into light. It had been the end of 33 years of searching, but it had also been a kind of beginning, an end to uncertainty, a start of acceptance, a transition from desperate hope to mourning to eventual peace. The sun set over Portland, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Helen watched the light fade, thinking about her son seeing his last sunset in October 1997, thinking about all the sunsets he'd missed in the 27 years since. But she was also thinking about tomorrow, about the future, about what came next. The nightmare was over. The searching was done. David and Owen were at rest, and Helen Pritchard, after 33 years of living in suspended animation, was finally ready to start living again.